welcome everybody. This is our first webinar in our COVID-19 Response and Recovery series. And we're very pleased to have so many of our donors, grant partners and colleagues from philanthropy with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're holding this webinar on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders of other communities who may be with us today. Now we live in a Zoom world. We have opportunities to cross many different territories. So I'd first also like to welcome our three key speakers, Dr. James McMahon, who's the Head of Clinical Research at the Alfred Hospital, Chris Povey, who's the CEO of Justice Connect, and Katherine Ellis, CEO of Youth Affairs Council Victoria, who will also be joined by one of her team, Mija, Gwyn. I can really strongly acknowledge that these three have demonstrated really outstanding and agile leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. They are wonderful examples of leaders in the health and community services fields. We'll also hear from two of our program managers, Erin, Dolan and Torsi. The Q&A function is on Zoom, so we'll have questions at the end of the three presentations. So feel free to send them through, and then at the end we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. But first of all, I'm just going to give a little bit of context about the Foundation's response to COVID-19. And particularly to explain that as a community foundation that's been around since 1923, we have actually been involved in responding to disasters that have affected Melbourne and the broader community for many, many years. And probably the first major one was the Black Friday bushfires in 1938-39 summer. So we've had a lot of experience responding to disasters. And however, I think COVID-19 is a community challenge on a huge scale, which has so many health, social and economic consequences. It's really in a class of its own. So the observation I made when we went back into lockdown 2 and how it affects our granting and our approach to philanthropy is usually in a disaster, you start with the immediate relief and then the medium-term response and then longer-term recovery and rebuilding. But with this situation we're in at the moment, we're actually responding to all of the stages of disaster at once. So it actually makes it really challenging for everybody involved. So we're just funding the fantastic work of all of the health and community services sector leaders that we can. But we acknowledge that this is not a normal disaster situation. So we've decided to approach COVID-19 through 4 lenses. First of all is responding to the health impacts of COVID-19, and the Alfred Hospital presentation that we'll be hearing shortly is in that category. Then the next approach is scaling up community services to meet demand, and the presentations from Justice Connect and YACVIC relate to this lens. And we particularly note in that the issues relating to risk of homelessness and also the very powerful issue of unemployment is really emerging as big things to respond to, particularly as it affects young people and women. In the third category, supporting organisational and charitable sector resilience, we're really already funding some organisations directly, but also looking at collaborations more broadly to support the charitable sector. Which is going to be very important that we come through COVID-19 with a robust charitable sector who are able to respond to all the social and issues that we will find ourselves facing. The last part of our response is building back better, and we were sort of well on the path to this when we've had to actually come back and think about some of the earlier stages as well. And that really is focusing on how could we actually come back and address some of the big issues we've been working on for many years, such as homelessness and such as our need to do a very fast climate transition as we recover from COVID. So we have been making grants in those areas and also looking at opportunities with social enterprises, for example, in relation to employment. But this webinar is focusing on the first two, so responding to the health impacts of COVID-19 and scaling up to meet demand. So the first project that we're talking about is really responding to the treatment of people who are most at risk. And the foundation as a whole, we have a lens where we really want to assist the most vulnerable groups in our community and the most vulnerable communities. So across everything we do, that is a lens that we apply. And when COVID-19 first began, the board and I were discussing how could we respond in terms of the health challenge, and how could we actually do this in a way that would help vulnerable communities. And I sought advice from Professor Brendan Murphy, who was then our Chief Medical Officer. Very fortunately, Brendan and I were on the hospital board together for about 10 years. So I was able to talk to Brendan and ask for some recommendations. And he recommended the team at the Alfred Hospital for the amazing work they were doing in infectious diseases generally, and some of the work that they were proposing. So I got in touch, and Dr. James McMahon, who I will introduce imminently, he responded. He presented a few different options to us for the sort of projects that they needed support for. And the most attractive projects from our point of view were ones that could build on existing research and could really scale up quickly. And so they were the one we went with, or in fact, in the end, we were able to sort of cover two aspects, and particularly focus on people who were in residential care, so older people, which we've all seen has been a huge issue, and people who are immune compromised, which the Alfred team had extreme experience in. So I think the other aspect that we really liked about the team was that they have national and international connections, so all of the work they're doing can be translated into other settings. So we recommended a grant of $250,000 to the board on the 20th of March, which, given sometimes timelines in granting, this was probably the speediest grant ever made by the foundation, but very, very important. So I'd just like to first introduce Dr. James McMahon to talk about the research that they're working on and the impact it's having. And strangely, due to COVID-19, James and I have never met in person. So it's kind of weird for me to have such a major grant and not have actually met the project lead in person, but that's the world we're in. Dr. McMahon is an infectious diseases clinician researcher and head of clinical research at the Alfred Hospital, and an infectious diseases physician at Epworth and Monash Medical Centre. His research interests are in clinical trials focused on COVID-19, HIV cure and antiretroviral therapy. For COVID-19 research, he has established a biobank to collect longitudinal samples and clinical data from infected individuals across 6 hospitals. He is leading the Virco clinical trial to study antivirals in hospitalised and community infected individuals with COVID-19, and is site investigator for multiple treatment and prophylactic trials at the Alfred. Dr. McMahon chairs the Antiretroviral Guidelines Committee for the Australian Society of HIV Medicine and sits on the Treatment and Chemoprophylactics panel for the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. So welcome, James.
Katherine, thank you for that lovely introduction. And yes, I'm sure we'll catch up in person one day soon. So I think I've got about 10 minutes to talk, and I just would like to first make sure that I acknowledge the contribution from Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation formally, and now hopefully I can describe how the impact that has had for us. It's really interesting hearing Katherine describe that, and March 2020 seems like literally a decade ago, and so much has happened in that time. And looking at the way you've introduced Lord Mayors and their focus, there could be nothing more appropriate than your foundation focusing on COVID-19 when it comes to vulnerable populations. And I think even since we developed those initial ideas around the vulnerable populations that are affected by COVID-19, I've reflected a lot on the fact that actually COVID-19 seeks vulnerable populations. And it's very reminiscent for me because I'm actually originally an HIV researcher, and HIV is a viral infection that also tends to seek vulnerable populations, marginalised groups. These are people with poor access to care, low and middle income countries, marginalised groups in society, often like transgender populations or same-sex attracted populations who often suffer a lot of issues in society in accessing care and treatment. And we're seeing more and more with COVID-19 that individuals that don't have access to care and treatment and in poor socioeconomic status are going to be adversely affected and unable to protect themselves from acquiring. So I think that COVID-19 really is demonstrating that in Australia and globally. I think the other thing I'd like to discuss is just the impact of philanthropy in this setting. Philanthropy has played a massive role in the ability to respond to this this pandemic, and the speed at which this has developed. The normal funding cycles for us as researchers or investigators or clinicians to be able to do projects to have impact, a lot of the normal funding mechanisms, they're just not possible. So if you think about procedures where we would write applications to government bodies, which they would be then a long period of peer review before they would be considered eligible and funded and then implemented. Those cycles typically take a year or two, and clearly that just wouldn't work if we were going to try and have an impact in the setting of COVID-19. So philanthropy and Katherine's quick action, I think, to try and find appropriate people to be involved in this work. And you've noticed, obviously, a lot of other philanthropic bodies have probably been the major drivers of impact in terms of health and research. So specifically in terms of this project that this funding has led to, we've been able to rapidly set up and approve a project whereby we people who enter our hospitals, and this is a network across many hospitals in Melbourne now from this that's stemmed from this funding, to recruit people who've got COVID-19 in the hospital and also in the community, and try and understand why people in hospitals that or that have severe outcomes like ICU and die, for example, or get very unwell, why do those individuals have poor outcomes, and why do some people that have mild incomes? So we also recruit people who've got COVID-19 in the community or have recovered from COVID-19 and didn't need to be admitted. And we get blood samples from those individuals, really to mainly look at how their immune system is responding to the infection, and also get extra samples of the virus. And then we've been able already in that short time to recruit over 150 people. And we've set this project up at the Alfred, Eastern Health Network, Monash Medical Centre Network, and also Epworth, where people have been recruited from all those sites, and we've been able to go to people's homes as well. And those samples already have been distributed to over 7 laboratories and research groups in Victoria and interstate, with more groups of these samples already been going. And we already have results, and they're describing ways in which people are protected or not from COVID-19. And these results are being written up, and it's already describing groups of people, including vulnerable populations such as people from residential aged care facilities. I think a really important vulnerable population actually is healthcare workers, which has been a huge issue in this pandemic, and describing how those individuals are protected from the infection and how those responses can be assessed over time, which is a critical element. So I just want to emphasise the importance of the speed of the response by Lord Mayors and other philanthropic bodies, and the impact then that is already happening, and the translation of that initial approach to funding, to a project, to results, to dissemination within months has been absolutely fantastic for us. As Katherine also mentioned, when we get these early injections of funds, it leverages our whole ability to conduct a whole range of research, because the reality is that we spend actually a lot of time in this space trying to get funding. It's very time consuming to write a lot of proposals and things. So that ability to get that initial funding meant we could then also launch into treatment studies. And Katherine mentioned the Virco trial. which there'll be some media on hopefully in the next day or two. There's been a little bit so far, but we've just started this study, and that's another type of study trying to enroll people with COVID-19 onto treatments, investigational drugs. And we're doing that for people in the hospital, for example, at Alfred and other collaborating hospitals that'll be involved. And also in the community. So we're going to people's homes who've just been infected with COVID-19 and enrolling them into a study where they receive either an antiviral medicine. The first one of it's called favipiravir, which is a drug that was originally developed for influenza, or a sugar pill. So it's what's we call a placebo-controlled study. So we think that there's so many people in the community with COVID versus the hospital. We also need to go to the community and investigate whether treatments in that setting will be effective. And again, that trial has been triggered by some other philanthropic funding, and we're actually seeking more. So if anyone's feeling particularly interested about that idea of supporting that research, I can provide more information about what that study involves. And we're trying to expand that project up to further sites and possibly even broader than Victoria. So I think that, and then we're sort of layered over the top of that, that people on that study will also be contributing samples to this biobanking project that Katherine described. So they will be extremely valuable samples because we'll be capturing people right at the start of their infection, understanding how their bodies are interacting with this virus, and then we get additional samples for many months afterwards and understand the long-term effects of the infection on those individuals. So I think hopefully I've captured some of the main ways in which this support has led to our ability to quickly enact clinical projects for people with COVID, and then, as I said, more quickly then establish collaborations and work with multiple different groups around Victoria and the state to explore the things that can really benefit people with COVID-19. And that inextricably is marginalised populations, as we see with this virus, more and more the people that are most adversely affected. So I'm happy to take any questions later if needed, or I'm sure you can email me separately as well if you wish.
Thank you very much, James. It's wonderful to see how it's all building on each other and the very sort of practical outcomes that there can be for treatment. So we'll probably have questions, I'm sure, but we're going to take a bit of a turn to one of the social issues which has emerged, and that is the risk of homelessness and the amazing work that Justice Connect has been doing in that space. So I'd like to hand over to Erin Dolan, who's our Program Manager, Homelessness and Affordable Housing, to introduce Chris Povey. Erin?
Hi, everybody. So just by way of background, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation has a long history in funding issues around homelessness. Our work in homelessness is focused on interventions that prevent entry into homelessness or prevent entrenchment into homelessness. And the foundation recognizes that the lack of affordable housing is one of the primary causes of homelessness and is committed to supporting innovative responses that increase the supply of quality affordable housing. So it's not an exaggeration to say that the pandemic has brought about some of the most significant policy reforms in housing and homelessness we've seen in the last 50 years. Most rough sleepers across Australia have been rapidly rehoused, and that was a feat that was previously deemed impossible. Job seeker, stagnant for more than 2 decades, was doubled, and the federal government injected funding into family violence and mental health services. Now, rental moratoriums were enacted, ensuring that tenants couldn't be evicted if their jobs had been affected by COVID-19 restrictions and couldn't pay. Tenants and landlords were now encouraged to negotiate, but it was clear that many renters didn't know where to begin. So the foundation had an existing relationship with Justice Connect. Specifically, the foundation funded a project that looked at ways of helping women at risk of homelessness in a more holistic way. And from that project grew the idea of an online platform which became Dear Landlord. So as we entered lockdown, it was clear that many people were going to have difficulty paying their rent, and we needed a rapid way to help individuals really help themselves. And that help needed to be on scale, it needed to be remote, and it needed to be high quality and able to adapt to the changing laws. So quickly, the foundation funded Justice Connect to provide tailored information via its online self-help hub that directly responds to the coronavirus. It specifically aims to help those who have recently been made unemployed stay in their homes by providing up-to-date information on tenancy. Dear Landlord is helping renters with the necessary tools to stay housed. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Povey, who I've worked with for over a number of years. Chris has spent 15 years as a lawyer with a range of social justice organizations, including the Consumer Action Law Center, Tenants Victoria, Victoria Legal Aid, Justice Connect, and the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission. And I would have loved to have used the acronyms because that was a bit of a mouthful, Chris. Chris serves on the board of the Australian Pro Bono Centre and the Federation of Community Legal Centres, and previously served on the board of the Council to Homeless Persons. And in 2010, Chris was awarded a prestigious Churchill Fellowship to conduct in-depth research into housing sustainability and homelessness prevention. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much, Erin, and hi, everyone. Just want to add my acknowledgement to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, Woy Wurrung, because I'm in Brunswick here, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, I want to talk about four things, and I think Erin's done such a great job of introducing this work. I want to start with a little bit of context. Then I want to go to what that context means in relation to legal need. I want to talk about what we've done. And finally, I want to touch on the sort of things that we're discovering. So if you'll indulge me, firstly, I just wanted to talk about three reflections that I've had really this year about the context and the place in which we find ourselves. So the first one is, it was on New Year's Day. Woke up, didn't have a big night, I promise. I had a text message from a friend of mine at Legal Aid at night, setting a meeting of legal sector partners at 9 a.m. This is 9 a.m. on New Year's Day. And you probably could imagine what it related to. It was about the bushfires. So we'd endured weeks and weeks of terrible smoke haze. We knew the devastation, the lives lost, the wildlife, the land and property destroyed. And the sector came together and we talked about enacting a protocol about collaborating really well and trying to address the legal need that came out of that disaster. The reason I start there, and this is obviously a COVID discussion, but is because that all of a sudden was the start of a different way that we need to think about need in this country and probably beyond, really. The fact is, and I'll come back to this, the scale of this disaster, the scale of COVID, really poses really very significant challenges. In terms of the bushfires, we had people, our focus was on the East Coast. Places where we didn't have lawyers or staff on the ground, we had to think about how to tackle that challenge. And also we needed to think about the systems that enable to do us. So that was one of the first reflections that I wanted to offer. The second one was quite a specific one. On 17 March, I remember we were in the boardroom at work. I was sitting with some of the senior team members and we had some Justice Connect directors on video conference and we're trying to do strategy stuff. So obviously for people who remember about mid-March, that's when things started to get really ugly. And we're sitting there and you know that kind of moment where you just can't engage? We were there and we're sort of trying to talk about what the directions might be or what the inputs were. And everyone just kept on refreshing the Age on their mobile phone or, you know, ABC online, trying to figure out what the news was. You know, you're finding stories about banks abandoning the docklands or other big companies or law firms having COVID scares. And I think that something that Dr. McMahon talked about earlier was the pace of change. And so I think that was one of the things that really struck me from that day. So that morning we decided to move the entire workforce of Justice Connect to working remotely. Just incredible. I mean, wouldn't have thought that were possible at the start of the month. And our ability to get our head around the pace of change and all the things that were happening was really limited. And fair to say that on that day, we didn't get a lot of strategy stuff done. And the final thing I wanted to kind of reflect on was this week. So Sunday, stage 4 curfews introduced tighter restrictions on movement. Monday, massive restrictions on the ability of business to operate. And then on Tuesday, I had to talk at a staff meeting, and I was thinking, what do I say to people? How do we approach this? And I came back to really what our strategy is about, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But this thing about we value high intensity service provision, and Erin talked about that. Our women's homelessness work that we've worked on with the foundation is really very, very important and getting some great outcomes. But when you see this kind of population level change, we need to think differently about how we tackle the need. And so now I wanted to touch on a little bit about what this kind of environment means for legal need. So the first thing I think is, for us, the COVID impact is going to be an economic impact. And we know that economic impact is actually going to drive legal need. So eviction, credit and debt matters, bankruptcy, and so on. The other thing that Erin touched on was this issue about policy change. So we see that daily, sometimes hour to hour, moment to moment, law and regulation is actually changing very, very quickly. And we see how the people that we work with, particularly people experiencing disadvantage, are really struggling to keep up with that and often at risk of kind of adverse outcomes there. The second point I want to make there was, we know that research says legal need impacts your health, your housing, your family relationships, and financial stability. So they're important. I mean, they're not abstract issues. They're actually integrated and really tightly related to your life. We also know that the legal assistance sector is tightly what we call residualised. So it's only available to people who are the most disadvantaged. So about 14% of Australians live below the poverty line, and only 8% of people qualify for free legal assistance. And there's also a staggering amount of unmet legal need already. So about 10 years ago, the landmark research on this said about half of Australians every year have a legal problem, and only half of that number could get legal help. So 4 million Australians a year miss out on legal help. So in that context, you know that there's a massive gap, and you know that COVID is going to drive a big increase. So what are we to do? So I'm going back to that early March period. We started working remotely on the 18th of March, and I find it incredible that less than 2 weeks later, we put in an application to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and soon after that, our application was approved and we got to work. Our purpose at Justice Connect is about high impact interventions. So we're designing kind of projects and services, trying to think about how to increase access to legal support in order to achieve social justice. So really, we're very focused on legal need. And as I said before, our strategy is about how to tackle the need that's actually going to really escalate in the coming months and years. So our project was really about this idea of future homeless. So we're looking at people who are not yet in our sector, people who may not have ever used our services or needed us ever before. We're focusing on them. So what can we do? Our thesis is that this group of people might be have a stronger ability to access and use information. We want to equip them with information that they need, enable them to take action, and navigate how to the changing landscape, the changing rules and policies. So it's the other thing that I wanted to really touch on was it's not just the what. So I think that's really important, but it's also the how. So this work, this project has really enabled us to collaborate in different ways. We've brought new online expertise in. We've also worked across program lines. So with our homeless law team, our courts team, our public interest team, our comms and our digital team have all come together to work really, really closely in order to develop products. Erin, I just wanted to check in with you. How am I looking for time? Pretty good. I'm just looking at the running sheet here. I've got a few more minutes to go. Good. So I'll take a breath. So I think that the what and the how is quite important, because quite often the development of responses can get clogged up within an organisation and approvals and those sorts of things. And that's not what we wanted to happen. And that's not what, I mean, if you look at the way in which the project was administered, that's not what the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation wanted either. When you look at what we discovered, there are a few interesting things going on here. Traffic to our website has more than doubled. We had more visits in April than in any other month in our history. In May, new users were up 180%. So We've been doing, as I said, we brought on some additional expertise in relation to online outreach. So that was a big part of the focus for us. Doing things like search engine optimization. We audited our social media channels to figure out that, are we reaching the people we needed to reach? We were tracking search terms, and we're using all of those inputs to produce relevant communications. So I'm not going to go into the range of different digital tools at Justice Connect, but we've got things that are about how people can apply for help, how we can place them with our pro bono network, how people can ask questions and get legal advice online, but also Dear Landlord, which is not just about information, it's about responsive information. And this project enabled us to actually tailor this online information that enabled people to write letters or understand what actions they needed to take. It enabled us to tailor that information to the range of information that was steadily coming through, sometimes week to week, day to day. So we developed resources through responding to what we knew from individual service delivery, the insights and expertise of staff, and insights from digital channels. Those resources related to a range of issues: tenancy, employment, banking, finance, courts, emergency powers. So what you find is that all of these legal issues are kind of clustered together and linked. And the trends, I think, it's interesting. Some of the most popular resources were about solving financial problems, accessing courts, emergency powers, a huge amount of information there. And quite often you found even government was referring to some of our resources. And I think there's a real issue with government producing a lot of policy change, but not necessarily thinking about how consumers can access that. And of course, resources on tenancy and COVID. So I'll just finish up with just some quick reflections on insights from some of this work. So as to the what, I think we're seeing legal and social issues presenting in clusters. So I said this before about tenancy, employment and financial issues all linking together, and some major issue in interest in emergency powers. In Victoria, there's been a huge interest in the eviction moratorium, how to negotiate rent reductions, how to take advantage of some of these rights. We are being approached by this new cohort, these people who have never used the service system before. The group, as we talked to Erin about, this group of future homelessness, who really, but for help, may end up entering kind of the service system that we really would prefer they not. It's about preventing some of that hardship. There's some interesting stuff about bite, snack, meal, which is this idea of give people a little bit of information online and then they might kind of nibble at it and dive into some more detailed information or take advantage of a tool. But perhaps I'll save that for later, and I can talk later, Erin, as well about what's next, because I think this is absolutely a way of working and developing and iterating and pushing out material that we want to continue.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris and Erin. I think what's next is actually one of my first questions for you all. So that's it's great to be. I mean, everybody's trying to think ahead to try and prevent, as you say, more hardship if we can. So we'll continue now in terms of another group that are being adversely affected by COVID-19, and that is young people. And I'd like to hand over to Stephen Torsi, who's our Program Manager of Education and Employment, to introduce the Support for Young People project.
Thank you, Katherine. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen. The Foundation has focused on working towards economic equality for a number of, well, all the way through its impact areas. You can arguably make the point that economic equality is one of the driving purposes of the organisation. And in my particular area, the education employment impact area, we focus on trying to reduce the current and emerging skills and capabilities gap to improve life and work readiness for particularly school-aged young people. And our second outcome is really about increasing economic inclusion, resilience and workforce adaptability. And the work that contributes to these outcomes include education innovation, employment-focused social enterprise, employment service innovation, place-based collaboration, network building, policy development, and advocacy. So a whole broad range of tools that we bring to bear on these issues. During the past 3 months, we've focused on gathering intelligence from numerous sources, trying to identify the gaps and community needs. And what has become very clear, as Chris and Erin and Katherine have already alluded to about this current crisis, is that it's a health crisis that has created an economic crisis. And we've been really working to understand who's been most affected and where they are and what role philanthropy can play to fill the gaps. It's becoming clear that young people, particularly those already disadvantaged, such as young people with a disability, or young women, young Indigenous people, and young refugees and migrants are facing a lifetime of health and economic impacts from this crisis. Youth unemployment has jumped to anywhere between 13 and 14% and up to 20% in some areas. And commentary of generational scarring is not overstating the issue. And I'm sure Katherine will be able to give us some more detail around what's occurring. And during our intelligence gathering, we attend webinars and networking meetings and read reports and trying to keep up with the government announcements very closely, because as you would be aware, it really is it's a macro scale issue, and the government have responded at various stages and at various levels. It's through one of the calls that we heard about the work that Youth Affairs Council of Victoria and how they were responding to the crisis. And YACVIC is the peak body and leading policy advocate for young people and the youth sector in Victoria, and has an increasingly influential voice at a national level. I'll introduce the YACVIC team in a moment, but firstly I wanted to describe how we worked together to develop the COVID-19 response grant approved by the board in June. YACVIC CEO Katherine had outlined to us that the challenges faced by the organisation and the unprecedented increase of demand for services, particularly from member organisations seeking support, and from individual young people, particularly young people with a disability, looking for support through YACVIC's Youth Disability Advocacy Service. And once we understood the breadth of need across the organisation, we worked with Katherine and the team to focus in on some key priorities and where there was most alignment with the foundation's work and how best the foundation could support the priorities of YACVIC. And after a series of emails and phone calls, an application was developed that zeroed in on providing additional advocacy resources for young people with a disability, many of whom have been particularly isolated during this pandemic and will continue to need significant additional support well into the recovery phase. We agreed a 3-year commitment that would be able to provide YACVIC and the YSAS team with the stability needed to address the needs of young people as we move through this crisis. I'd now like to introduce Katherine Ellis, YACVIC CEO. Katherine joined YACVIC in May 2019 and has over 25 years diverse experience in senior positions across the private, public and not-for-profit sectors, with extensive expertise in youth development policy and practice, organisational leadership and change management, and cross-sector collaboration. And joining Katherine is Mija Gwyn, who is the manager of the Youth Disability Advocacy Service. Mija has worked widely in the disability advocacy and arts sectors, and she's led and coordinated film festivals, arts and community development projects in the United Kingdom and Australia. And Mija is joined by her interpreter, Michelle, who I hope you can all see on the screen there. Over to you, Katherine.
Thanks, Stephen. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all sitting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and actually make a special note of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, who a lot of whom are cut off from community and culture and country at the moment due to the COVID-19 restrictions and are finding it very, very tough. I go by she, her pronouns. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for having me here. So I think it's no surprise to anybody that young people are being disproportionately affected by COVID. There has been a lot of media coverage of it, which has been good because quite often young people's stories are left out completely. But in actual fact, what that shows is how serious it is, and also the fact that the impact is going to be long-term. There's evidence from the global financial crisis that young people still have not fully recovered in terms of employment and things in the 10 years, and then suddenly we're hit by COVID-19 as well. And what we're also seeing is that all the existing youth issues are being exacerbated, and COVID has actually exposed a lot of weaknesses in the system. So there's really obvious impacts. Jobs, in actual fact, the youth unemployment rate is 16.4% now, but what's probably worse is that there's 36% underemployment. So that's more than 1 in 3 young people are actually not working as much as they want to. And actually, contributing their full talent to our communities. And the impact has been disproportionate for young people because so many of them are in casualised jobs. It's really impacted on industries that employ a lot of young people, so retail, hospitality, tourism, and entry-level jobs were scarce in the first place. And now young people who are trying to transition from education to work are actually going to be competing for those scarce jobs with more experienced unemployed young people, more experienced unemployed people. And there are going to be 20,000 school leavers at the end of this year who will all be entering or trying to enter the workforce on top of all the ones who've already lost their jobs. There's also disrupted education, and that's homeschooling, but also, for a lot of young people, they don't have the devices and the data if they're in rural areas or from low socioeconomic households. And quite often they're in home situations where they don't have the support either, so very crowded households, or have with parents or grandparents who don't have the education levels, the technology, understanding the language barrier, and there's language barriers as well. And the third very sort of obvious and well understood area is mental health. And of course, losing jobs, having disruption to education, and the very important social isolation that's being caused for young people all can lead to very serious mental health issues. And recent research by FYA has shown that about 60% of young people are worried about their mental health at the moment. There are also a lot of less obvious impacts. And I've got a slide which we did. I'll just share it while I'm talking. I mentioned social isolation already. What we don't really realise that, everybody's socially isolated right now. But for older people, we actually have our networks sort of established. We have family groups established. For young people, this is the time in their lives when, they're trying to build networks, meet new people, develop their identity. There's a lot of rites of passage which they're missing, and that's actually a bigger impact for them than I think a lot of us understand. Also, young people who are in situations of family violence, or who may be LGBTIQA plus young people who are being forced to return home because they've lost jobs and they can't afford to pay their rent, or they're being locked down with families that are not affirming of their sexuality. I've already mentioned the impact for Aboriginal young people of being cut off from their communities. Young people are finding it harder to access contraception and abortion services. A lot of young people from culturally and linguistically diverse families are being expected to be tutors to their siblings because their parents can't help with the education from home. And there's other risks, young women disengaging from sport. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the situation of international students and temporary work visas, a lot of whom are young people being left to fend for themselves without any support. So it's a lot of different ways. You might have noticed I've left out disabled young people, and that's because my colleague Mija is going to talk in more detail about that cohort in a moment. And what this has also meant is there's a huge demand and stresses on organisations and workers who work with young people. So that's another sort of point, as an organisation, YACVIC has had to look at. So our response, because we work with young people and with the sector who supports young people, our response to COVID has had to be a sort of two-part response. So for young people, the first thing we tried to do, and we're still trying to do it, is just synthesise all the information. There's been a deluge of information, overwhelming for young people. Quite often, well, most of the time, not being communicated through channels that young people get their information from. So we've had to put a lot of emphasis on communications and doing sort of what I consider emergency advocacy. So in the media and in government response efforts, talking about the disproportionate impact and the unrecognised impacts, trying to counter some of the uninformed solutions. So there's a lot of emphasis on skills and training for young people. But the reality is there's no point in training young people who are, in most cases, already skilled for jobs that just don't exist now. The effort has to be put into job creation. And there's a bit of defence of young people in that advocacy as well. So a lot of young people are being blamed for what's going on. The sacrifices they're making for the wellbeing of the community are not being fully recognised. And yet there are a lot of positive stories out there about the efforts that young people are making to play a role in this situation. And then for the youth sector itself, the work we've been doing has been very much about bringing the sector together, helping share information and a level of synthesis for the sector as well, and making sure that they are all understanding what's going on for different cohorts, what the government directives are, sometimes where there are funding opportunities that are coming through because of COVID, helping them with tips on how to keep staff morale up and keep an eye on staff wellbeing. And it's really interesting, I think one of the silver linings of COVID is there's so much more collaboration right now than I've ever seen before. And I really hope that that remains after this is all over, because the connections and the peer support and the information sharing and joint projects and things has been amazing. We've set up huddles, so they're online Zoom meetings for youth sector leaders, for workers in rural areas, for workers in metro areas, and trying to do all of that. And then, of course, we also had to look after our own organisation and make sure that our staff were ready to remote work and that our financial sustainability was okay and staff wellbeing was protected. And thank God we invested back in January in moving all of our systems to Office 365 and all of our files onto the cloud. So moving home was actually okay for us, but I know a lot of organisations had enormous troubles. And particularly in the not-for-profit sector, we're always trying to do everything on the smell and bag, and there's very little willingness to invest in things like systems upgrades. And you see in a moment like this just why that's so important. So I really encourage you to think about supporting organisations in that kind of way as well. And going forward now, we're at the moment doing we're working on a youth-focused recovery campaign, and I won't go into too much detail because I'm conscious of time, and also it's still in development. But it's really about making sure that everybody understands what priorities we need to be looking at for young people going forward, and how we can all work collectively, not just government, not just the youth sector, but also philanthropy, academia, unions, everybody working, because young people were fearful for their future before because of climate change and inequality and failing institutions. And with COVID now, they are terrified. And if we don't all work together, we need to all work together to make sure that they're not a scarred generation. Now, I'm just going to hand to my colleague Mija to talk a little bit about specifically what's going on for disabled young people and the impact that the grant from Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation is going to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on Wandi land, which is southwest New South Wales, close to the border of Victoria. I've been working home for the last few months, and I would like to acknowledge their elders, past and present. My pronouns are she and her. And as Katherine has already mentioned, there are a plethora of impacts on young people with disability, given the current situation we're in. But prior to COVID-19, there were already significant systemic barriers and issues facing young people with a disability. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has just exacerbated those. Because there has not really been tailored support for young people with a disability, given the current situation, so it has had more significant impact on that cohort. YACVIC has actually completed a survey which took place during the first lockdown, and it showed that young people with disability had more concerns than those without, and the main issues were faced by young people with a disability were the lack of social networking opportunities with their peers and peer support, also resources for education and remote learning, because some young people with a disability they have supports with them within the school, but they didn't have those same supports at home. Also, learning materials and resources and access to those. So they were provided to students that they might have been provided to students, but they weren't also tailored to those with a disability and their particular needs. There were also increased issues related to specific disabilities. So some young people who also have chronic health conditions are more at risk of contracting COVID-19, and the health impacts would be far more significant for those people. And that would also impact their being able to receive supports in their home because of those health concerns. So those who relied on people coming into their home to offer support were firstly very fearful. And also, if you think about the lack of PPE and the capacity for COVID-19 testing. So in the last 2 weeks, what we have seen is an increase in that, and the NDIA have updated their rules so that people with a disability are able to use their NDIS funding to obtain PPE, which is wonderful in being able to provide those to their support workers if they were unable to access them anywhere else. There are also issues in support workers being able to access infection control training. And we are so grateful to receive funding from the Lord Mayor's Foundation. And we were able to recruit an individual advocacy staff member to help look at these issues facing young people with a disability and work on some advocacy campaigns to try and resolve some of the increasing and complex issues for individual cases. Because of COVID-19, these individual cases have unfortunately become more complex. So they will be working within our self-advocacy team and providing mentoring to our staff on developing their capacity and skills to instill more confidence so that they can work on the individual cases. And I think that it's important for these young people with a disability to see out their human rights and participate in the community, regardless of what's happening around them.
Thank you, Mija and Katherine. That was very, you've raised so many issues. I'm trying to distill all that you've said, and I'm very pleased that there is this new role to work on these issues and work on the solutions. We actually need to move to some questions now. We haven't got a lot of time, so I'm just going to, there's two that I might ask at once, and maybe if James, Chris and Katherine could all respond. First of all, have there been any unforeseen positive outcomes of the projects we've discussed today? And also, what are your hopes for the next few months and beyond? So, James, would you like to answer that first?
Just unforeseen positive outcomes, was that the question?
Unforeseen positive outcomes, and then the hopes for the next few months.
Sorry, I'll just start my video there. I suppose I alluded to some of them. The unforeseen positive is just the flow-on effect of the funding to be able to conduct other research. So we have a whole sort of combination of projects. One, we mentioned around this biobanking project to get the samples, and that leads to other work with other laboratories, and then we find results, and that leads to other ideas for other projects. And then it also leads to our capacity to undertake other studies, for example, this treatment trial, this Virco trial I mentioned. So I think that's probably, it just becomes a catalyst for other work in the space, specifically in COVID. It's probably the most important thing.
And what about for the next few months? What are your key hopes given this complex situation we're in now?
Well, I suppose it's a multifaceted response could be there. Just generally, I mean, obviously in Victoria, we've got very high case numbers. We're all very hopeful, and we really should see a reduction in those case numbers with the current measures that we're seeing. But that may take some time. If we look at other epidemics around the world, it can take many weeks to months to really sort of push those numbers down. So we're going to be extraordinarily busy still conducting these studies and recruiting people to these studies, and we'll get further results. We'll will establish models of research which are quite new, because the complexity of going into someone's home who's got COVID is not straightforward in terms of protecting staff, but it's extraordinarily valuable to be able to provide treatment opportunities or understand how that can be done, let alone research. So there are models of work that we are developing which can be a huge advantage to a whole number of groups of people with COVID, particularly vulnerable populations, especially, I would have thought.
Great. Well, thank you, and good luck with all of that. There may be more questions, but Chris, what about you in unforeseen positive outcomes in the work Justice Connect's doing?
For me, the thing that I've been really interested in is these new ways of working. So I think it was you, Katherine, mentioning agile, and I think people perhaps hear that a lot and don't actually kind of know what it looks like. Here in this particular case, we gave a group of experts the authority and the capacity to try and tackle some of the challenges that we're seeing as a community, about generating useful resources and then looking at the information that's coming back, the feedback that we see online from that, and then generating new resources. And what we found is actually that setup was quite time consuming. There's a lot of coordination about who's doing what and who has authority for what and that kind of stuff. But after that infrastructure was set up, watching how that team started to build up speed and momentum and start producing resources was, for me, extremely impressive, because you didn't have that kind of organisational traffic of stuff going up and down. So for me, and going forward, I think this does connect with our strategy very deeply. I'm really interested in how we can use this kind of model of working in different areas of the organisation.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the issues that you expect to be dealing with through Dear Landlord and some of your other services, what would your hopes be for the next few months?
I really hope that it continues to be as valuable as it's turned out to be. So we've seen that the resources about what people do or what people need to know when they're encountering problems with their rental, it's been very, very helpful, and we expect that will only continue, particularly as some of the government support falls away. So I suppose bad news is good news in terms of the uptake of the tools. So what we would expect is that those tools continue to be useful. But one of the things that we need to be alert to is when we're getting that feedback about what's changing, whether there's policy or legislative or regulatory reform, what we need to be doing is continuing to generate up-to-date and relevant information, which is not easy.
Thanks. And Katherine, maybe you might like to talk about the hopes for the next few months, and particularly that broad range of issues and the youth-led recovery concept, which I think is very interesting. Maybe just briefly touch on that.
Thanks, Katherine, and thank you to the Foundation for the support for our work, because it's enormous. It's going to make an enormous difference to those young people. I think that in a lot of ways there's recognition of mental health and education investments. What we need to be looking at now is how are we going to create jobs for young people so that they're not permanently scarred and out of the workforce for potentially their whole lives. And I think what is also really important is recognising the importance of grassroots youth services, whether they're based in a local council or a local not-for-profit, or hanging off a school, or different ways that they operate in the community, because those grassroots local supports for young people actually play a huge role in a situation like this. And most of them are really strapped for financial resources and recognition, and but they can actually do early intervention, which prevents young people from getting into more critical states and needing more sort of crisis care as well. So I think that that's very important to understand. And so in terms of a youth-focused recovery, we're going to be really, as I said, trying to build a collective movement to build a real understanding of what young people are going to need over the next 5 years, maybe even 10 years, and make sure that we're investing in that right across the community, across the government, across business, philanthropy, academia. Everybody can play a role, and as much as we can make sure that young people don't come out of this scarred and don't come out of this in a way that they're not actually going to be the future positive, productive citizens that Victoria and Australia needs.
Thank you. Yes, they're one of our most valuable resources. So we're running out of time. So I think we'll have to thank all our speakers. It's been really very insightful. I'm feeling quite inspired by how else we can help all of you. We're going to be looking at supporting the resilience of the charitable sector in the next webinar, and we'll send you information about that. And then also the next seminar after that in the series will be about building back better. So we'll have a really good look at some of our opportunities where Australia could actually, address some of these issues as we recover from COVID-19. So thank you all very much. There's going to be a post-event survey, so we really would appreciate feedback so we can do better and get the information to our supporters and friends that people want to hear. So I wish you all well, stay safe and well, and thank you very much for participating. Thank you.